What happens when a respected comedian and television host sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to face a barrage of personal attacks and condescending remarks? In just 41 seconds, a single comment about British comedy would trigger the most explosive television meltdown ever caught on camera, turning a professional interview into a career-defining moment that would expose the true character of both men involved. The studio lights blazed hot that evening as John Oliver adjusted his tie, settling into the uncomfortable chair across from Piers Morgan. The CNN studio felt smaller than usual, the cameras closer, the air thicker with tension that neither man seemed to acknowledge yet. Oliver had agreed to this interview reluctantly, knowing Morgan's reputation for stirring controversy, but professional courtesy demanded he show up. "So John," Morgan began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed superiority, "you've made quite a career out of mocking America from your little perch at HBO. Tell me, do you ever feel guilty about biting the hand that feeds you?" Oliver blinked slowly, processing the loaded question. "I wouldn't characterize my work as mocking America, Piers. I think there's a difference between holding power accountable and simple mockery." "Oh, please," Morgan scoffed, leaning back in his chair with theatrical dismissal. "You're a British comedian who moved to America and now makes millions telling Americans how terrible they are. It's rather rich, isn't it?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they'd expected from a talk show interview. Oliver maintained his composure, his voice steady despite the obvious provocation. "I think you're misunderstanding the purpose of political satire, Piers. The goal isn't to tear down for the sake of destruction. It's to shine light on issues that might otherwise go unexamined." Morgan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Issues? You mean like making fun of small-town Americans for your elite coastal audience? Very brave work there, John." "That's not what I do," Oliver replied, his patience beginning to wear thin. "If you actually watch the show, you'd know we spend considerable time on systemic issues, corporate malfeasance, policy failures, things that affect real people's lives." Right, Morgan waved dismissively. "And I suppose you think you're some sort of journalist now? A serious news person? Because from where I sit, you're just another British comedian who couldn't make it in proper British television." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense they were witnessing something beyond normal interview friction. Oliver's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained level. "I'm curious, Piers, what exactly you hope to accomplish with this line of questioning? Are we here to discuss my work, or are you working through some personal issues on television?" "Personal issues?" Morgan's voice rose slightly. "I'm simply pointing out the obvious hypocrisy of your position. You've built an entire career on American free speech and American opportunity, and yet you spend every episode telling Americans how backwards and stupid they are." "That's categorically false," Oliver said, his accent becoming more pronounced as his composure began to crack. "And frankly, it's beneath you to mischaracterize my work so completely. Have you actually watched Last Week Tonight? Or are you just repeating talking points?" Morgan smirked, sensing he'd found a nerve. "I've seen enough to know that you've made yourself very comfortable criticizing a country that's given you everything. Tell me, when was the last time you said anything positive about America? When was the last time you said anything positive about anyone?" Oliver shot back, drawing surprised murmurs from the studio audience. "This entire interview has been you attempting to provoke conflict rather than engage with ideas." The host's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Careful now, John. You're a guest on my show, and I'd hate for this to become unpleasant." "Become unpleasant?" Oliver repeated incredulously. "Piers, it became unpleasant the moment you decided to attack my integrity rather than discuss my actual work. This isn't journalism, it's performance art." Morgan's face flushed red. "Performance art? You want to talk about performance art? Let's talk about your little HBO show where you preach to the choir about how enlightened you are compared to ordinary Americans." "Again, you're mischaracterizing everything I do," Oliver said, his voice rising for the first time. "But I suppose accuracy isn't really your strong suit, is it? After all, this is coming from someone who was editor of a tabloid newspaper." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morgan's expression darkened as he leaned forward aggressively. "How dare you bring up my newspaper career as if it discredits my journalism? I've been in this business longer than you've been telling jokes, and I've interviewed world leaders while you were doing comedy in pub basements. And yet here you are, conducting an interview that wouldn't meet the standards of those pub basement comedy shows?" Oliver replied coolly. "At least comedians are honest about what they're doing." The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Morgan's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. "You arrogant little man," Morgan hissed. "You come into my country, take advantage of our opportunities, make millions off our system, and then have the audacity to lecture me about standards? You're nothing but a privileged Oxford graduate who thinks his accent makes him clever." Oliver stared at Morgan for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. The professional mask was beginning to slip, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "And there it is," Oliver said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge. "The real Piers Morgan, not the professional interviewer, not the serious journalist, but the petty, bitter man who can't handle being challenged." Morgan's laugh was ugly now, all pretense of civility abandoned. "Challenged? By you? You're a comedian, John, a joke teller. Don't mistake your HBO platform for actual relevance." "At least I know what I am," Oliver replied, his voice steady but cold as ice. "Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Morgan's face twisted with rage at Oliver's simple yet devastating response. The studio audience held its collective breath as they watched a professional interview transform into something much more personal and ugly. "What did you just say to me?" Morgan's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can come on my show and question who I am? I've been a successful journalist and television presenter while you were still learning to tie your shoes." Oliver leaned back slightly, but his gaze never wavered from Morgan's face. "Success and respect are two different things, Piers. You can buy success, but respect has to be earned through your actions and character." "My character?" Morgan exploded, his voice echoing through the studio. "You want to talk about character? Let's talk about how you abandon your own country to make money in America, then spend your time insulting the very people who pay your salary." "I didn't abandon anything," Oliver replied calmly, though his hands were now clenched in his lap. "I followed an opportunity, like millions of people do. The difference is, I don't pretend that gives me the right to attack others for doing the same thing." Morgan jumped to his feet, towering over the seated Oliver, his face purple with rage. "Sit there and take your medicine, you sanctimonious little worm. You think your clever wordplay makes you better than everyone else, but you're just another foreign opportunist." The camera operators exchanged worried glances. This had gone far beyond normal television tension. Oliver remained seated, looking up at Morgan with an expression of genuine disgust. "Foreign opportunist," Oliver repeated slowly. "There it is, the real heart of your problem with me. It's not about my work or my success, it's about the fact that I'm not American, and you think that disqualifies me from having opinions? Don't you dare turn this into some immigration debate," Morgan snarled, pointing an accusatory finger at Oliver. "This is about respect. Respect for the country that made you rich and famous." "Respect," Oliver said, finally rising from his chair to face Morgan directly. "You want to lecture me about respect while you've spent the last 10 minutes insulting my work, my background, my character, and my right to exist in this country." The irony is absolutely breathtaking. Morgan stepped closer, his voice rising to a shout. "You ungrateful little parasite. America doesn't need another foreign critic telling us what's wrong with our country. We have plenty of our own problems without importing more from failed comedians." The studio fell dead silent. Even the producers behind the cameras seemed frozen by the sheer venom in Morgan's words. Oliver's face went completely pale, then flushed red with anger. "Failed comedian?" Oliver repeated, his voice barely controlled. "From someone whose own countrymen were so embarrassed by his behavior they practically exported him to America. Tell me, Piers, how does it feel to be unwanted on both sides of the Atlantic?" Morgan's hand shot out as if to grab Oliver, but stopped inches from his chest. "You little weasel, how dare you bring up my past when you're nothing but a second-rate comedy writer who got lucky?" "Lucky?" Oliver's composure finally cracked completely. "Lucky? I've worked for everything I have. I didn't get handed opportunities because of my connections or my willingness to invade people's privacy for profit. I earned my place through actual talent." "Talent?" Morgan laughed bitterly. "You call reading jokes off a teleprompter talent? You're not a journalist. You're not even a real comedian. You're just a British accent in an expensive suit." Oliver stepped forward, his face inches from Morgan's. "And you're just a bitter, washed-up tabloid editor who can't handle the fact that people see through your act. At least I'm honest about what I do." "Honest?" Morgan screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You're a fraud, a fake. You hide behind comedy to avoid taking real positions on real issues. You're too cowardly to be a real journalist and too untalented to be a real comedian." The audience gasped audibly. Several people were standing now, unsure whether to leave or stay. Oliver's hands were shaking with rage, but his voice became deadly quiet. "I would rather be a fake comedian than a real bully," he said, each word precise and cutting. "I would rather hide behind jokes than hide behind false moral superiority and manufactured outrage." Morgan's face contorted with pure hatred. "Get out," he hissed. "Get out of my studio. Get out of my show. Go back to your little HBO bubble where everyone tells you how brilliant you are." "Gladly," Oliver replied, straightening his jacket with exaggerated calm. "But before I go, let me say something to your audience. This is what happens when someone mistakes volume for authority, cruelty for honesty, and bullying for strength." "Security?" Morgan bellowed, his voice cracking with strain. "Get this man out of here. He's disrupted my show long enough." Oliver turned toward the cameras, speaking directly to the viewers at home. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed the real Piers Morgan, not the professional interviewer you see on television, but the petty, cruel person who hides behind his platform to attack others." "Turn off his microphone," Morgan shouted to the production booth. "Cut to commercial. This interview is over." But Oliver wasn't finished. This is what passes for journalism in some circles: personal attacks, manufactured controversy, and the complete abandonment of professional standards. Two security guards appeared at the edge of the set, looking uncertain about how to proceed. The situation had escalated beyond anything they'd been trained for. Morgan pointed at the guards, then at Oliver. "Remove him, now! He's trespassing on my set." Oliver looked at the approaching security guards, then back at Morgan. "I'll leave on my own. Thank you very much. I have no interest in sharing space with someone so fundamentally dishonest." "Dishonest?" Morgan's voice reached a new pitch of hysteria. "You're calling me dishonest? You're nothing but a coward hiding behind comedy." Oliver paused at the edge of the set, turning back one final time. "No, Piers. A coward is someone who uses their platform to bully guests instead of engaging with their ideas. A coward is someone who attacks people's backgrounds when they can't attack their arguments." Oliver's words cut through the chaos like a blade, and for a moment, the entire studio fell silent. Morgan stood frozen, his chest heaving with rage, as the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of his complete professional meltdown. "You think you're so clever with your little speeches?" Morgan finally managed, his voice hoarse from shouting. "But everyone can see what you really are. You're just another elitist who thinks he's better than ordinary people." Oliver shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity crossing his face. "Piers, the only person who's revealed their true character tonight is you. And it's not a pretty sight." The security guards hesitated, looking between the two men uncertainly. This wasn't a typical removal situation. No one had thrown a punch or made physical threats. It was purely a battle of words, but somehow more devastating than any physical altercation could have been. Morgan seemed to realize that the cameras were still capturing his breakdown. He straightened his tie and tried to regain some composure, but his hands were visibly shaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the cameras directly, his voice still trembling with barely controlled fury, "what you've just witnessed is exactly what's wrong with modern comedy. These people think they can come on serious news programs and turn them into their personal soapboxes." Oliver let out a short, bitter laugh. "Serious news program? Piers, you just spent 15 minutes attacking my nationality, my career, and my right to have opinions. If this is your idea of serious journalism, then journalism is in deeper trouble than I thought." The studio audience began to murmur among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Several people were gathering their belongings, preparing to leave. "Don't you dare lecture me about journalism," Morgan snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at Oliver. "I've been doing this job since before you knew what a television camera was. I've interviewed presidents, prime ministers, world leaders, and apparently learned nothing from any of them about grace, dignity, or professional behavior." Oliver replied coolly. "Interviewing important people doesn't make you important, Piers. How you conduct yourself does." Morgan's face flushed red again. "You arrogant, sanctimonious little man. You come into my studio, disrespect me in front of my audience, and then have the nerve to lecture me about behavior? I disrespected you?" Oliver's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "Piers, you opened this interview by questioning my integrity, attacking my work, and suggesting I don't belong in this country. I simply responded to your attacks with facts." "Facts?" Morgan scoffed. "You call personal insults facts? I called you a bully because you're acting like a bully," Oliver said simply. I called you unprofessional because your behavior has been unprofessional. These aren't insults. They're observations based on your own actions." The production assistant was frantically signaling to Morgan from behind the cameras, clearly desperate to end this disaster. But Morgan seemed oblivious to everything except his own rage. "Get out," he said again, his voice lower but no less venomous. "Just get out of my sight. Go back to your little comedy show where you can make jokes about people who actually matter." Oliver nodded slowly, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what the truly tragic thing is, Piers? You actually had the opportunity to have a real conversation tonight. You could have asked about comedy, about journalism, about the responsibility of people in media. Instead, you chose cruelty. I chose honesty," Morgan shot back, "something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you on your pretentious British backside." "No," Oliver said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You chose to reveal who you really are when you think the cameras aren't judging you. Except they were, and everyone saw it." Morgan glanced around the studio, suddenly seeming to notice the horrified expressions on the faces of his crew, his audience, even the security guards. The reality of what had just happened began to dawn on him. "This interview is over," he announced weakly, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "We're going to commercial." "No need," Oliver said, walking toward the exit with his head held high. "I'm leaving, but I want everyone watching to remember what they saw tonight. This is what happens when someone confuses power with authority, volume with strength." He paused at the studio door, turning back one final time to address the cameras directly. "To anyone watching who works in media, who has a platform, who has the privilege of reaching people, remember this moment. Remember that how you treat people when you think you have power over them reveals everything about your character." Morgan stood alone on his set, surrounded by uncomfortable silence. The studio audience was filing out quietly, many of them shaking their heads in disgust. His production crew avoided eye contact, busy with suddenly urgent technical tasks. "Cut the cameras," Morgan said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the silent studio. "Just cut the cameras." But it was too late. The damage was done, captured in high definition for the world to see. In trying to destroy John Oliver's reputation, Piers Morgan had succeeded only in destroying his own credibility. The interview that was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance had become a masterclass in how not to conduct yourself as a professional. Oliver walked out of the studio with his dignity intact, leaving behind a host whose true nature had been exposed for millions to witness. The 41 seconds that began with a snide comment about British comedy had ended with the complete professional implosion of a man who had confused cruelty with strength and bullying with authority. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras finally stopped rolling, one thing was crystal clear to everyone who had witnessed this television disaster. In a battle between class and cruelty, dignity and degradation, professionalism and pettiness, there had been only one winner. And it wasn't the man whose name was on the show.